Beatrice was radiant, her smile lighting up the bar like the colorful lights dancing on the walls. She was surrounded by friends, all gathered around her at a table filled with clinking glasses and hearty laughter. The reason for the celebration? Beatrice's new car, an achievement that symbolized her independence and determination. "I still can't believe you did it," exclaimed one of her longtime friends, raising her glass enthusiastically. "That car is so powerful and full of style," Beatrice laughed, her heart pounding with joy. "It was a battle. But I finally got it," she replied, her words laden with emotion. "You all know how much this means to me." Another friend stood up, raising his glass in a solemn gesture, though with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "To our ray of sunshine, Beatrice, may this car take you to even more incredible places, and may you never run out of fuel for the dreams you still have to realize." Everyone around echoed the toast, raising their glasses in unison. To Beatrice they shouted, their voices mingling with the loud music and the buzz of the bar. Beatrice, feeling her eyes well up with tears, raised her own glass, moved. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you, everyone. You are incredible. I'm so happy to share this moment with all of you." She took a sip of her drink, tasting the sweet flavor of success mixed with the deep gratitude of having such wonderful friends by her side. As everyone clapped and more laughter echoed, Beatrice allowed herself a moment of contemplation. That night, more than a celebration of a new car, was a celebration of everything she had overcome to get there. And for a brief moment, she felt invincible. Beatrice's phone vibrated discreetly in her pocket, briefly interrupting the laughter and lively conversation around her. She took a quick glance at the screen and smiled when she saw her parents' names flashing. With a subtle gesture, she signaled to her friends that she'd be back in a moment and moved away from the table, looking for a quieter spot in the bar to take the call. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad," Beatrice answered enthusiastically, her voice still tinged with the joy of the celebration. She could hear the familiar sounds of home in the background, the television, and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. "Beatrice, dear, congratulations on the new car." Her mother's voice was warm and full of pride, almost as if she were hugging her daughter. "We know how much this means to you. We're so happy. You deserve it, my daughter. You've always worked so hard. We are so proud of you," added her father, his voice firm but laden with emotion. Beatrice felt a wave of warmth in her chest, as if her parents' pride were wrapping her in a comforting blanket. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. You've always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. This car, this achievement, it's because of you." Suddenly, a younger, more excited voice joined the call. "Beatrice, I want to take a ride in that car as soon as I can. I bet it's awesome." Her younger brother, always full of energy, spoke with enthusiasm. Beatrice laughed, imagining the eager look on his face. "Of course, little brother. You'll be the first to take a ride with me," she replied, feeling a pang of longing and affection for him. After a few more minutes of conversation, Beatrice said her goodbyes, promising to visit the family over the weekend. Before hanging up, her mother added, "Oh, send hugs to everyone there, dear. We know your friends are very special to you." Beatrice ended the call with a smile on her face, feeling even more strengthened by her family's love. As she returned to the table, her friends noticed the soft expression on her face. "Who was it?" her friend asked, leaning in curiously. "My parents," Beatrice replied, still smiling. "They sent hugs to all of you and said they're very proud." A chorus of awe echoed around the table, followed by more laughter and warm comments. Beatrice rejoined the group, feeling completely filled with the support and affection of those who mattered most in her life. The conversation flowed naturally among the friends, each sharing stories and laughing at the memories that bonded them. Amidst this relaxed atmosphere, a new topic came up. "Hey, did you hear about the comet that's supposed to pass by tonight? It sounds amazing. They say it'll be the brightest one in the last 50 years, said one of Beatrice's friends, gesturing broadly, his enthusiasm evident as he explained the astronomical phenomenon. Beatrice, who had been listening attentively, raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A comet? Really? She looked around as if seeking confirmation from her friends' faces. "Yes," confirmed her friend, nodding. "I read about it earlier. It's supposed to pass around midnight. I was thinking of going up on the roof to get a better view." Beatrice smiled, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "It sounds fascinating. But today is such a special day for me. I was so focused on celebrating the new car that I didn't think about anything else." "I understand," said Melanie, Beatrice's best friend, with a sympathetic smile. "But maybe it's worth checking out, even if it's just for a minute. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event, Beatrice. Just like your car." Beatrice tilted her head, reflecting. "Yeah, you're right. But to be honest, my heart is so full with everything I'm experiencing right now. I might decide on the spot, depending on how I'm feeling." As the conversation shifted to other topics, Beatrice kept thinking about the comet, wondering if that rare moment in the sky should be part of an already special night. Even surrounded by friends, her mind wandered between the excitement of continuing the party and the idea of witnessing a celestial spectacle that could be the perfect final touch to the day. Melanie watched Beatrice closely, noticing that her friend was becoming increasingly excited as the glasses of drink piled up on the table. With each sip, Beatrice seemed even more euphoric, but there was something in her movements, a slight unsteadiness that began to worry Melanie. "Beatrice, you're on your fourth drink," Melanie said softly, moving closer to her and placing a caring hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's a good idea to take it easy now. We still have the whole night ahead of us, and you know how alcohol can catch you by surprise." Beatrice, with rosy cheeks and a sparkle in her eyes, let out a light laugh, shaking her head. "Hey, relax. I'm feeling great. Today's a day to celebrate. Remember, it's not every day you buy a new car." "I know," Melanie insisted, the concern clear in her tone. "But you know how things can get out of control quickly. I just want to make sure you have fun and get home safely." Beatrice paused, looking at her friend with a warm but determined smile. "I understand your concern, really, but trust me, I'm fine. I'm in control." She raised her glass, winking at her friend before taking another sip, as if to reinforce her confidence. Melanie sighed, realizing her words weren't having the desired effect. "Okay, Beatrice, just promise you'll keep an eye on how you're feeling, okay? I don't want anything to ruin your night." "I promise," Beatrice replied with a firm nod. "I'll be fine, and if I feel like I'm overdoing it, I'll stop immediately. But right now, I'm going to enjoy the moment, because I deserve it." Melanie forced a smile, but the knot in her stomach didn't disappear. She stepped back, trying not to show how much she was still worried, while Beatrice excitedly rejoined the group, unaware that the balance between fun and danger was beginning to tip. The early morning hours advanced, and the bar began to empty, leaving behind only the soft music and muffled conversations of the few patrons still resisting sleep. Beatrice, her face flushed from alcohol and the excitement of the night, looked around, realizing it was time to go home. She stood up from the table, swaying slightly, and began to say goodbye to her friends with warm hugs and promises to meet again soon. "It was an amazing night, everyone, but I think it's time for me. I'll hit the road before sleep catches up with me," said Beatrice, her words slightly slurred but still filled with enthusiasm. Melanie, who had been watching her closely, immediately stood up, her heart tightening with concern. "Beatrice, wait a minute," she said quickly, approaching her. "You've had a lot to drink, honey. Let me call a cab for you." "I don't want you to risk driving in this state." Beatrice frowned, as if the idea of not driving herself was absurd. "I already said I'm in control. I don't need a cab. I'll just drive carefully. Besides, my car is new. I want to enjoy every moment with it." Melanie grabbed Beatrice's arm, her eyes locked on hers, trying to convey her concern. "I know you love your car, but it's not worth the risk. What will happen if you lose control, even for a second? Think about it." Beatrice sighed, visibly irritated. "I appreciate your concern, really, but I'm fine. I already said I'll drive slowly and be careful." "I don't worry so much." Beatrice pulled away from Melanie with a confident smile, trying to dispel the tension. "Please, Beatrice." Melanie tried one last time, her voice now tinged with desperation. "Think of everything you've achieved. It's not worth putting it in danger for an impulsive decision." But Beatrice was resolute. "I've made my decision. I'll be fine. See you tomorrow, okay?" She gave her friend one last quick hug, grabbed her keys, and walked toward the door, leaving Melanie behind with a heavy heart and a worried look, knowing that her words hadn't been enough to prevent what could be a tragedy. As she crossed the bar's doors, Beatrice felt the cool breeze of the early morning and took a deep breath, as if the sensation could clear her mind. However, the slightly unsteady steps and the faint buzzing in her head were clear signs that things were not as under control as she wanted to believe. Even so, she headed toward her car, determined to prove that nothing could spoil what had been, until then, a perfect night. Beatrice settled into the driver's seat, feeling the soft leather under her hands as she started the car. The smooth hum of the new engine brought a smile to her face. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the slight buzzing in her head before shifting into gear and pulling out of the bar's parking lot. The streets were quiet at that hour of the early morning, with few cars passing by and the city enveloped in an almost surreal silence. Beatrice enjoyed this feeling of freedom. The whole world seemed to belong to her at that moment as her firm hands gripped the steering wheel. As she drove, the night sky caught her attention. She remembered her friend's words about the comet, and her gaze instinctively turned upward, searching for the celestial phenomenon. "Can I see it from here?" she murmured to herself, her interest captured by the idea of witnessing something so rare. Suddenly, between the sparse clouds, a bright streak crossed the sky, illuminating the darkness with an ephemeral and magical light. Beatrice gasped in admiration. "Wow, how amazing!" she exclaimed, her eyes fixed on the comet as it continued its journey across the firmament. The beauty of that moment completely enveloped her, the fascination growing with each passing second. But as she allowed herself to be captivated by the stunning vision above her, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel, and her eyes drifted away from the road. The world around her began to blur. The streetlights and the outlines of the sidewalks turned into mere peripheral shadows. The road, once clear ahead of her, became a distant blur in her field of vision. Lost in the grandeur of the comet, Beatrice barely noticed that the car began to drift slightly to the right, veering into the other lane. She was so immersed in the celestial spectacle that the notion of impending danger completely disappeared from her mind. "It's so beautiful," she whispered, unaware that her car, now out of control, was about to cross the path of another vehicle. A few hours earlier, in another part of the city, the soft and welcoming light of a restaurant illuminated the table where David Damber and their son Robert were gathered for dinner. It was a quiet evening, and the family was enjoying the meal in each other's company. The sound of laughter and conversations echoed around them. Robert, a curious 10-year-old, was entertained with his plate while his parents exchanged knowing glances and affectionate smiles. "I love these moments with you," Amber commented, her voice soft and full of affection. She took David's hand across the table, squeezing it gently. "After such a hectic week, it's nice just to be together," David smiled, agreeing. "I couldn't agree more. The hustle and bustle of daily life make us appreciate these moments even more, and what could be better than a family dinner?" As they enjoyed the moment, the television in the corner of the restaurant caught Robert's attention. Distracted by the movement of people, he stopped chewing for a moment, his eyes widening as he saw the news on the screen. "Look, Dad, Mom, they're talking about a comet," he exclaimed, pointing excitedly. Amber and David turned their heads to the TV, where an image of the starry sky was displayed. The presenter was enthusiastically talking about the rare passage of a comet that would be visible that night, something that only happened once every several decades. "A comet," Amber repeated, her interest piqued. "That's something we don't see every day. What do you think, David? Should we go take a look?" David reflected for a moment, noticing the excitement on his son's face. "It sounds like a great idea. We won't have another chance to see something like this for many years. What do you think, Robert? Want to go to the beach to see the comet?" Robert almost jumped out of his chair, his eyes shining with excitement. "Of course I do. It's going to be amazing," Amber laughed, sharing her son's enthusiasm. "Then it's decided. We'll finish our dinner and head straight to the beach." The mood at the table filled with excitement as they quickly made plans for the night. They paid the bill and got up, ready for the little adventure that awaited them. Amber wrapped her arm around Robert as they left the restaurant, feeling the coolness of the night as they stepped outside. "I can't wait to see this comet," Robert said, his voice full of anticipation. "Neither can I," my dear, Amber replied, exchanging a knowing look with David. "It will be an experience we won't forget." David, holding Amber's hand, looked up at the sky, already imagining the spectacle that was to come, unaware that this night, which seemed so perfect, was about to change their lives forever. When they arrived at the beach, David, Amber, and Robert were greeted by the gentle sound of waves crashing on the sand and the freshness of the night breeze. The cold sand under their feet and the dark horizon seemed to promise a spectacular view of the comet. However, as they looked up at the sky, they noticed that a dense layer of clouds had begun to form, obscuring the stars, and more worryingly, the view of the comet they had been eagerly waiting for. Amber sighed, disappointed. "What a shame. The clouds are covering everything. We won't be able to see the comet from here." Robert looked at his parents, his excitement beginning to turn into frustration. "But we can't just leave without seeing the comet, Dad. I was so looking forward to this." David, determined not to let the night go to waste, placed his hand on his son's shoulder and smiled. "Don't worry, Robert, I have an idea. Let's go to the building where I work. The terrace is very high and should be above these clouds. From there, we'll have a clear view of the sky." Amber, always practical, nodded. "Sounds like a great idea. Let's give it a try." Robert's face lit up again, full of renewed hope. "Let's go then. I want to be the first to see the comet." With the decision made, the family returned to the car, the sound of the tires on the wet sand marking the change in direction for the night. As they drove through the quiet streets, David kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was focused on what they might find once they reached the building. As David drove along the road, the entire family's eyes were fixed on the sky through the car windows. To their surprise, the comet was already visible, shining with an intensity that made the surrounding darkness seem even deeper. Robert, sitting in the back seat, was absolutely mesmerized, his eyes wide with pure admiration. "Dad, Mom, look at that. The comet is huge. It looks so close," Robert exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. He leaned forward, trying to get a better view through the glass. David, keeping his attention on the road, smiled at his son's enthusiasm through the rearview mirror. "It's really amazing, son, but remember to keep your seatbelt fastened, okay? Just a little longer until we get to the building, and you'll be able to see everything even more clearly." But Robert, impatient, began to struggle with the seatbelt. "I can't see well from here. I'm just going to loosen it a little, just to get a better view." Amber, noticing the movement in the back seat, immediately turned to her son. "Robert, it's dangerous to unbuckle your seatbelt while we're on the road. Please listen to your dad and put it back on." However, Robert was determined. He pulled the seatbelt off, leaning closer to the window, his face pressed against the glass as he tried to capture every detail of the comet. "I just want to see better, just for a second." David, now visibly concerned, gave his son a firm look through the rearview mirror. "Robert, it's not safe. I need you to put the seatbelt back on now." "I won't repeat myself," Robert frowned, crossing his arms in defiance. "But I just wanted to see better." "It's not fair, Dad. The comet is incredible, and I'm stuck back here." Amber, trying to calm the situation, spoke in a softer but equally firm tone. "Robert, please listen to your father. We'll be at the building in just a few minutes, and then you'll be able to see the comet however you like. We just need you to stay safe until then." But Robert's discontent was palpable, and he was reluctant to obey. The bright and distant comet attracted him like a magical promise, something he didn't want to miss for even a second. The tension in the car was growing, with David and Amber's voices firm in their attempts to protect their son, while Robert, still stubborn, couldn't understand the danger he was in. Meanwhile, Beatrice, still mesmerized by the beauty of the comet streaking across the night sky, hardly paid attention to the road ahead of her. Beatrice didn't notice the car in front of her, the vehicle belonging to David's family, until it was too late. A sudden, shrill sound of a horn cut through the air, but the shock between reality and her daydream was brutal. Her body reacted instinctively, her hands turning the steering wheel, but there was no time to avoid the impending disaster. "Oh my God, no!" was all Beatrice could scream, her voice filled with panic. She slammed on the brakes, but the impact was inevitable. The crash was violent. Beatrice's car, larger and sturdier, collided with David's vehicle with devastating force. The collision caused a metallic sound to echo through the night, accompanied by the shattering of glass and the tearing noise of metal being crushed. Beatrice's body was thrown against the seatbelt, while David's much smaller car couldn't withstand the impact. Beatrice, still dazed, felt her car jolt violently, but it remained on the road, the tires screeching under the pressure. The other car, however, was sent into a wild spin. The deafening sound of metal against metal was followed by the terrifying silence of a car flipping over, rolling until it came to a stop upside down in a dreadful final stillness. The world around Beatrice stopped for a moment. Her heart raced as she tried to process what had just happened. Her wide eyes finally shifted away from the comet and focused on the scene before her. The family's car was destroyed, overturned, its wheels still spinning slowly in the air as a cruel reminder of the impact. The sight chilled her blood, and the reality of the situation hit her with full force. "My God, what have I done?" Beatrice murmured, her voice trembling as she tried to grasp the magnitude of the tragedy that had just unfolded. She remained motionless, her hands still gripping the steering wheel as panic began to overtake her body. Deep down, she knew that this moment would change everything forever. Beatrice remained paralyzed for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest and her ears ringing with the residual sound of the collision. Panic began to rise in her throat, as if each heartbeat echoed the reality of what had just happened. Trembling, she finally released the seatbelt with shaky fingers and pushed open the car door, feeling the cold night air hit her face, a shocking contrast to the stifling heat inside the car. As she stepped out of the vehicle, her steps were uncertain, as if she were moving in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Her eyes were fixed on the overturned car ahead, her vision blurred by the tears now freely streaming down her face. "My God, what have I done?" she whispered again, her voice weak and laden with terror. She approached the overturned vehicle, the sound of creaking metal and shattered glass reverberating in the deadly silence of the deserted road. Beatrice tried to pry open the car door with all her strength, her hands slipping on the dented metal. "Please, please open," she cried, pulling with all her might, but the door was jammed, as if the car refused to yield to her desperate attempt to help. Desperate, she began to scream for help, her voice echoing into the darkness. "Somebody help me, please. Someone help!" But the road was deserted, and the silence that followed her cries was terrifying. Beatrice's eyes fell on something on the ground near the overturned car, something that made her heart stop for a moment. With wide eyes, she slowly moved toward what she saw, dreading what she would find. As she got closer, horror overwhelmed her as she realized it was the body of a young boy. "No, it can't be," she murmured, kneeling beside the small body. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to check for signs of life, but she was so stunned that she could barely think clearly. "Please be okay. Please," she repeated, her voice breaking. She tried to feel the boy's pulse, pressing her fingers against his neck, but her lack of experience and the growing panic made it impossible to tell if he was still alive. Her fingers slipped, her thoughts were in chaos, and the uncertainty consumed her. Beatrice began to sob, tears mixing with pain and fear. "Someone help me," she screamed again, this time with a desperation that tore at her throat, but the emptiness of the night remained impassive, with no answer to her pleas. Every passing second could be vital, but Beatrice was powerless, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She was in complete despair, sobs shaking her body as she remained beside Robert's lifeless body. Her mind was spinning in circles, unable to process what was happening. She felt helpless, lost in a whirlwind of panic. "What do I do? What do I do?" she murmured repeatedly, without finding any answers. Suddenly an idea flashed through her mind like lightning. Miles. She needed Miles, her boyfriend, who, due to college work. Couldn't celebrate Beatrice's achievement with her and her friends. Trembling, Beatrice fumbled with her phone, her fingers clumsy, almost dropping the device several times before she managed to dial his number. Her heart raced uncontrollably as she listened to the sound of the call connecting. Miles, please pick up, she whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. Finally, Miles's voice came through on the other end of the line, full of sleep and confusion. Beatrice? What happened? Why are you calling at this hour? Beatrice tried to speak, but her voice came out in a choked sob. Miles, I did something terrible. An accident. I need you. Please come quickly. Calm down, Beatrice. Take a deep breath. Where are you? Miles's voice was now alert, full of concern. She gave her location in a trembling voice, the words spilling out in a disordered rush. On the road. I'll send you my location through GPS. Please hurry, Beatrice. I'm on my way. Stay where you are. Everything's going to be okay, Miles promised before hanging up. Beatrice remained kneeling beside the overturned car, feeling the unbearable weight of every passing second. Her eyes returned to Robert's body, the reality of what had happened crashing down on her with brutal force. The distant sound of sirens finally broke the deadly silence of the night, bringing with it a mix of relief and dread. Beatrice lifted her head, seeing the red and blue lights flashing in the distance, approaching rapidly. Her heart pounded, torn between the hope that someone might save the family and the fear of what the consequences of this moment would bring. A few minutes later, Miles's car appeared, closely followed by emergency vehicles. He rushed out of the car, his eyes filled with worry as he ran toward Beatrice. Beatrice, I'm here. What happened, Miles? I don't know. I don't know what to do, she cried, running into his arms. I think I hurt someone. I don't know what to do. He held her tightly, trying to calm her but also shocked by the gravity of the situation. It's okay, Beatrice. The paramedics are here now. They'll take care of everything, okay? You did what you could. The paramedics quickly approached the overturned car, their expressions serious as they began their work. Beatrice, still trembling in Miles's arms, watched helplessly as they tried to save the family. Every movement felt like an eternity, each second a crushing weight on her chest. After a few minutes that felt like hours, one of the paramedics approached Beatrice and Miles. The parents, David and Amber, are alive. They've suffered some injuries, but they're going to be okay. But the boy, Robert, unfortunately, he didn't make it. The words hit Beatrice like a final blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. She pulled away from Miles, her eyes wide with shock. No, please, no, she murmured, her voice broken by pain. She collapsed to her knees again, the reality of what she had done sinking in completely. Miles tried to hold her, but Beatrice felt like the world around her was crumbling, and there was nothing that could save her from the abyss she had fallen into. In the midst of the chaos, as the paramedics were still working to stabilize David and Amber, a police officer approached Beatrice. His steps were firm, and the look he gave her was filled with seriousness. Beatrice, still shaken and barely able to stand, hardly noticed his presence until he spoke. Ma'am, we need to perform some procedures, the officer said, his voice firm but not without a hint of understanding for her state. Please blow into this, he requested, extending a breathalyzer in her direction. Beatrice, trembling and with tear-filled eyes, almost didn't comprehend what he was asking. What she murmured, her mind still spinning from the reality of the accident. Miles, standing beside her, tried to guide her gently. Beatrice, you need to blow into this device. It'll be quick, he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his own heart was tight with worry. Without really understanding what she was doing, Beatrice complied. She blew into the device, feeling a strange disconnection from what was happening around her, as if she were watching everything from outside her own body. The officer looked at the result, and his expression immediately hardened. Mom, the test shows that you are above the legal alcohol limit for driving, he said, his voice now laden with an inescapable gravity. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I have to inform you that you are under arrest for driving under the influence of alcohol and causing an accident with a fatality. The officer's words fell on Beatrice like a final sentence, each one hitting her like a hammer, driving a nail into her already shattered heart. No, please, no, she whispered, her knees buckling again. Miles tried to hold Beatrice up, but she was completely broken, unable to process what was happening. The officer signaled to another officer, who approached with handcuffs. Beatrice did not resist as the cold cuffs were placed on her wrists, the metallic sound sealing the confirmation of what she already knew. Her life, as she knew it, was over. Please, I didn't mean to, Beatrice whispered, tears streaming down her face as the officer led her to the patrol car. She looked at Miles, who stood motionless, his eyes filled with sadness and despair, unable to do anything to stop what was happening. Days later, Beatrice found herself on the defendant's bench in a crowded courtroom. The silence in the room was overwhelming as the evidence was presented. With each word from the prosecutor, the reality of what she had done became clearer and more unbearable. The pain in David's eyes, who was present at the hearing, was a weight that Beatrice knew she would carry for the rest of her life. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and arguments, announced the sentence in a firm and unwavering voice. Beatrice Williams, you have been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter while driving under the influence of alcohol, causing the death of a child. Your sentence is 10 years in prison. The words echoed in the room, marking the end of any hope Beatrice might have had of escaping the reality of her actions. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the conviction and the growing emptiness inside her. There was no turning back, no immediate redemption for what she had done. Her future was now a prison, both physical and emotional, where time would be her only constant companion, marked by the regret of a night that changed everything. Within the cold, dark walls of the prison, Beatrice felt the weight of her guilt like a shadow that never left her. Every step she took down the narrow, lifeless corridor was accompanied by the echo of her own thoughts, a constant reminder of what she had done. The pain in her chest was a constant reminder, a weight that suffocated her daily. The days in prison dragged on slowly, each one resembling the previous but laden with the tension of being surrounded by other inmates, many of whom knew exactly why she was there. Beatrice could feel the furtive glances, the whispered exchanges between the women as she passed by. Their judgment was silent but sharp, like invisible blades that cut through her already fragile self-esteem. That's the drunk driver who killed a child, she heard a harsh voice whisper, as two inmates exchanged glances. Beatrice kept her head down, pretending not to have heard, but the words cut deep, adding to the whirlwind of emotions already consuming her. In the solitary cell at night, Beatrice's thoughts were even crueler. She found herself repeatedly returning to that fateful night, Melanie's words echoing in her mind like a constant lament. Beatrice, take it easy on the drinks. Let me call a cab. Don't take that risk. Every piece of advice that she had previously dismissed now haunted her. Why didn't I listen, she murmured to herself, her voice weak and choked with the tears that often silently soaked her thin pillow. She relived the scene repeatedly, imagining how everything could have been different if she had just listened to Melanie that night. Guilt was a constant companion, a presence that haunted every moment of her day. In the rare moments when she conversed with other inmates, the conversation quickly died when the topic of her crime arose. They saw her as an intruder in their community, someone whose actions had brought indescribable tragedy. You're not like us, one of the inmates said one day, her tone laden with disdain as she crossed her arms and looked Beatrice up and down. You had a life out there, you had choices, and you chose to destroy everything. Beatrice couldn't argue because she knew those words were true. She had had choices, and each one had led her to that point, locked in a cell with nothing but her memories and regrets for company. The loneliness, mixed with relentless self-judgment, and that of others, made each day an endless nightmare. In the silence of the cold nights, Beatrice would curl up in her bed, the regret and guilt pulsing in every thought, knowing that she could never undo what she had done. She was imprisoned both by the iron bars and by the unbearable weight of the consequences of her actions, a burden she knew she would have to carry for the rest of her life. The weekly visits were the only source of light in Beatrice's dark existence. Every time her name was called for the visiting room, her heart would race, yearning for a brief escape from the oppressive reality of the prison. Seeing her family, and especially Miles, was like breathing fresh air amid the suffocating atmosphere of guilt and regret that constantly surrounded her. When her mother visited, she brought with her a maternal warmth that helped soften the sharp edges of the pain Beatrice carried. Her mother's gentle hands would hold hers as she spoke with tenderness, trying to bring some comfort. We're here for you, dear. We know it's hard, but we're by your side. But we're your side. Beatrice would nod, her eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for everything I know. My love, her mother would reply, her voice choked but firm. Time helps to heal, but you need to be strong. And then there was Miles from the beginning. He had come faithfully, trying to be an anchor for Beatrice amid the storm. However, with each visit, the emotional strain in his eyes became more apparent, the burden of maintaining the relationship while the reality of what had happened crushed them both. On a particularly gray afternoon, Beatrice was sitting in the visiting room waiting for Miles when he finally entered. Something in his demeanor made her heart sink. He seemed different, more distant, as if an invisible wall had been erected between them. Hi, Beatrice, he said softly, sitting across from her. His voice sounded cautious, almost sad. Hi, Miles, Beatrice replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though fear was growing in her chest. Is everything okay? Miles took a deep breath, avoiding her gaze for a moment before finally meeting her eyes. Beatrice, I don't know how to say this, but I can't do this anymore. His words hung in the air like a suspended knife ready to drop. Beatrice felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. What do you mean by that? Her voice was a whisper, full of disbelief. I tried, Beatrice, I really tried, but all of this, it's destroying me too. I can't deal with the pain, the guilt, the loss. I'm so sorry, but I need to move on. I need space to breathe. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, the pain in her chest intensifying like a knife being twisted. Miles, please know you're all I have left. I need you. He closed his eyes for a moment, the pain clearly reflected on his face. "I know, Beatrice, and it kills me because I really wanted to be strong enough to get through this with you. But I just can't anymore. I'm drowning in this situation." Beatrice remained silent, tears streaming freely down her face. She had no words, only raw, crushing pain that seemed to tear away every piece of hope she had left. "I'm so sorry," Miles said, standing up slowly. "I hope you can forgive me one day, but I have to go." Beatrice could only watch as he walked away, each step feeling like a blow to her heart. When the door closed behind him, she felt the loneliness crash down on her like a ton of bricks. Miles, the last tangible connection she had to the outside world, was now gone too, leaving her completely isolated, sinking into an abyss of sadness and despair. The echo of the closing door was the last thing she heard before succumbing to silent sobs, feeling that the darkness around her had become even denser, almost impenetrable. After 10 long years, the prison gate finally opened for Beatrice. The metallic sound of the gears turning echoed like a prelude to freedom, but in her heart, there was a mix of anxiety and sadness. Every step she took toward the outside world felt heavy, as if she carried the weight of the years spent in that grim place. The sunlight, though warm and bright, momentarily blinded her, a painful reminder of all she had lost. As her eyes adjusted to the brightness, Beatrice anxiously searched for familiar faces. Her heart pounded with the hope of seeing more than just one figure, more than just her mother. She imagined for a brief moment that perhaps Miles had changed his mind, that he would be there to see her out, to try to rebuild something of what they had lost. Or maybe her father, who hadn't visited her in recent years, had finally found the strength to be there that day. But when her eyes finally focused, she saw only her mother, a solitary figure standing near the gate. The aged and tired face, still full of love, looked at Beatrice with a mix of relief and sadness. Disappointment weighed on Beatrice's chest like a stone, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes, even though she tried to fight them. "Hi, my dear," her mother said, her voice soft but full of emotion. She opened her arms to her daughter, who approached slowly as if still in shock. Beatrice entered her mother's embrace, feeling the familiar warmth and comfort, but the emptiness around them was undeniable. "Only you came," Beatrice murmured, her voice laden with a sadness she couldn't hide. Beatrice's mother held her tighter, as if her words broke her own heart. "I'm here, dear, I always will be. The others couldn't come, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're free and that we can start anew." Beatrice closed her eyes, trying to find solace in her mother's words, but the disappointment still weighed like lead. She had waited so long for that day, imagining countless times what it would be like to leave that prison. But now that the moment had arrived, all she felt was a deep sense of loss. There was no euphoria, no relief, just an emptiness that seemed endless. Holding her mother's hand, Beatrice gave one last look at the prison behind her, knowing that although she was free from the physical walls, she was still trapped by the consequences of her actions. Together they began to walk toward the car, but the world Beatrice found outside was different, less welcoming, less familiar. She was free, yes, but true freedom still seemed distant, lost on a horizon she could barely glimpse. In the days that followed, freedom brought Beatrice a new set of challenges, very different from those she faced in prison. With the stigma of being an ex-convict weighing on her shoulders, she found herself struggling to reintegrate into a society that seemed to have forgotten how to forgive. Every door she knocked on in search of a job seemed to close before she even had a chance to explain her situation. The looks of distrust, the fake smiles, and the polite excuses were constant, unfortunately. "We can't hire you," felt like another brick in the wall that isolated her from the world. One day, after yet another failed attempt to find a job, Beatrice walked down the street with her head bowed, trying to gather the strength not to give up. Her hopes were exhausted, and she felt increasingly lost, as if the world outside was as much a prison as the one she had just left. As she walked distractedly, a familiar voice called her name. "Beatrice," she looked up, surprised to see Melanie across the street. She hadn't seen her friend since before she was imprisoned, and the unexpected reunion brought a flood of conflicting emotions. She approached hesitantly, not knowing what to expect. "Melanie, I didn't expect to see you here," Beatrice said, her voice fragile, almost breaking. Melanie, with a cautious expression, looked at Beatrice for a moment before responding. "I didn't expect to see you either." The tension between the two was palpable, like a tight rope ready to snap. Beatrice couldn't hide the mix of relief and pain she felt at seeing Melanie, someone who once meant so much to her. "I tried to find you when I got out, but you never came to visit me in prison," Beatrice finally said, her voice carrying a sadness she couldn't disguise. I thought about you a lot." Melanie took a deep breath, her eyes showing a mix of emotions she struggled to keep under control. "Beatrice, I didn't know what to say, what to do. That night, everything that happened, it was very hard for me too." Beatrice felt a lump form in her throat. "I know I was wrong, Melanie. I know I should have listened to you that night, but I was blinded by euphoria, and look where it got me." That's what hurt me, Beatrix, Melanie responded, her voice finally revealing the pain she had held onto for so long. I warned you. I asked you to take it easy, not to drive, but you didn't listen. And now, because of that, a child suffered the consequences. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't face you. Melanie's words were like a sharp blade hitting Beatrix exactly where it hurt the most. She knew Melanie was right. Her refusal to listen to her friend that night resulted in the tragedy that shaped her destiny. I understand your pain and your anger. If I could go back and change everything, I would, but I know words can't fix what I destroyed, Beatrix replied, tears silently streaming down her face. Melanie remained silent for a long moment, watching Beatrix with eyes that mixed sadness and compassion. I never stopped caring about you, Beatrix, but it was hard to look at you without remembering what happened. Maybe I was a coward for not visiting you, for not supporting you, but I was broken too. Beatrix slowly nodded, understanding more than she could ever express. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything. Melanie sighed and finally stepped forward, placing a hand on Beatrix's shoulder. I know you are, Beatrix, and despite everything, I'm sorry too. Time has passed, and maybe it's time to try to leave some things behind. It might not be easy, but maybe we can start over as friends. Melanie's words, though laden with pain, brought a glimmer of hope to Beatrix's heart. She didn't expect everything to be resolved with a simple reunion, but the fact that Melanie was willing to try again was more than she could have hoped for. I'd love that, Beatrix responded, her voice still trembling but with a sparkle of hope in her eyes. The two embraced a hesitant but meaningful hug, signaling the beginning of a possible reconciliation amid the chaos of their lives marked by a shared tragedy. As they walked together through the city streets, Beatrix and Melanie began to talk about the past, something both had avoided for so long. The reunion was tense, but there was a thread of hope that maybe they could rebuild something of what they once had. However, a question that Beatrix had carried in her heart since the day of the accident began to grow a painful curiosity that she could no longer repress. Melanie, Beatrix began, hesitant but feeling the need to ask, do you have any news about the family from that night? What happened to them after everything? Melanie remained silent for a moment, her face dark as she recalled the few things she had heard over the years. She let out a heavy sigh before responding, choosing her words carefully. I don't know much, Beatrix. After the accident, the town was shaken, but the news about the family was scarce. I heard that David, the father, didn't handle what happened well. Beatrix felt a knot form in her stomach, her heart beating faster as she waited for Melanie to continue. I heard rumors that he became an alcoholic, Melanie continued, with a sad look on her face. They say he started frequenting the town bar regularly, drowning his sorrows in drink to try to forget, or maybe to not feel, but no one knows for sure what happened to him after that. I tried not to pay too much attention, it was too hard to think about. Melanie's words hit Beatrix like a ton of bricks, each detail a new blow feeding the already overwhelming guilt she carried. My God, I never imagined that he, Beatrix murmured, her voice full of pain. She stopped walking, her body tense as she processed the information. I destroyed that family, didn't I? Melanie looked at Beatrix, seeing the clear anguish in her eyes. Beatrix, what happened was terrible for all of us, but you've paid a high price for it. Maybe it's not fair, but it's the reality, and honestly, I don't know if there's anything that can be done to change what happened. Beatrix remained silent for a few moments, lost in her thoughts. Melanie's words echoed in her mind, but all she could think about was the man she had ruined, the life she had shattered along with her own. She couldn't bear the thought of David alone, drowning his pain in alcohol, while she, despite everything, still had the chance to rebuild her life. I need to see him, Beatrix suddenly said, her voice firm though full of emotion. I need to find David and try, maybe ask for forgiveness, try to help him somehow. I can't live knowing that he's destroyed because of me and not do anything. Melanie looked at Beatrix, surprised by the determination in her friend's eyes. Beatrice, are you sure? I don't know if he'll want to see you or if it will help anything. I don't know, she was admitted, her voice soft but laden with a purpose she couldn't ignore. But I have to try, even if he hates me, even if he turns me away. I need to do something. I need to try to fix what I destroyed in any way I can. Melanie nodded, understanding Beatrice's need to seek some kind of redemption, even if it meant confronting the very ghost of her guilt. I understand, Beatrice. If that's what you need to do, then do it. I'll be here if you need me. Beatrice gave a small smile, grateful for Melanie's support, even though the path ahead was uncertain and painful. With a heavy heart, but determined to face the past that haunted her, she knew she had to find David. She didn't know how or when, but that decision was already made. She would do whatever it took to try to redeem herself, even if redemption seemed impossible. Beatrice spent the following days in a state of growing restlessness. Finding David would not be a simple task, and the possibility that he might reject her outright haunted her. Each thought about the tragedy that had bound them together left her heart heavy, but the need to try to do something, anything to alleviate the pain she had caused, drove her forward. Certain that David would not accept seeing her immediately if he recognized her, Beatrice made a decision that morning. She looked at herself in the mirror, facing the woman she had been and the woman she needed to become. "I need to change," she murmured to herself, her voice filled with determination. With a pair of scissors in hand, she began cutting her long hair, each strand falling to the floor like a symbol of saying goodbye to the past. The short hair gave her a different appearance, almost unrecognizable. Then she dyed the strands a darker shade, something she would never have worn before. The transformation continued with makeup. She applied a more sober and mature style, hiding the marks of years of suffering while also creating a new version of herself, stronger and less vulnerable. Finally, she put on a pair of thick framed glasses, something she had never worn before, completing the disguise. Beatrice looked at her reflection, feeling a strange disconnection. The woman in the mirror seemed like a stranger, someone she barely recognized, but she knew it was necessary. "You can do this," she told herself in a tone meant to be encouraging. As night fell, Beatrice made her way to the bar where, according to Melanie, David spent most of his days. The place was immersed in a melancholic atmosphere, illuminated only by dim lights that cast shadows over the solitary figures sitting in their corners. The smell of alcohol and cigarettes was strong, mixing with the low sound of sad music playing in the background. As she entered the bar, Beatrice paused for a moment, her heart racing. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for David among the patrons. It didn't take long to find him, sitting at the bar, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost in the glass in front of him, where the amber liquid seemed to be his only companion. David was unrecognizable to Beatrice. The man she remembered as strong and full of life now seemed a shadow of his former self. The disheveled hair, the unshaven face, and the empty look reflected the pain and loneliness that consumed him. Beatrice felt a tightness in her chest upon seeing him like that, knowing that she was largely responsible for that devastating transformation. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice approached slowly, trying to stay calm. She sat a few seats away, watching him out of the corner of her eye, trying to gather the courage to speak. "May I sit here?" she asked, her voice low and cautious, trying not to reveal her anxiety. David glanced at her briefly, his tired eyes showing little interest. "Do what you want," he replied in a disinterested tone before turning his attention back to the glass. Sitting beside David at the bar, Beatrice knew she needed to take the initiative. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady as she introduced herself. "My name is Mary," she said with a slight smile, trying to appear friendly and approachable. David looked at her out of the corner of his eye, still wary but not moving away. "David," he replied curtly, his gaze quickly returning to the glass in front of him. Sensing his reluctance to talk, Beatrice decided to adopt a more subtle approach. "You know, David, sometimes I come here to escape my own memories. It seems like you understand a bit of that," she said, observing him closely to catch any reaction. David remained silent for a few moments, turning the glass in his hands as if pondering whether or not to open up. "We all have our ways of escaping," he finally murmured. "Escaping is easier than facing the pain head-on." Beatrice continued, encouraging him to talk more. "Pain can be overwhelming," she said. "I understand." That David let out a tired sigh, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. Something in the way she spoke seemed to strike a chord within him. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything," he said, his voice broken by bitterness. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine, knowing she was approaching the moment when he might reveal what she most feared to hear. "Maybe I don't fully understand, but I've lost enough to know that some pains never go away," she replied, trying to show empathy without revealing her true identity. David leaned forward, his gaze lost in some distant point of the past. "My wife, Amber," he began, "she never recovered after what happened. Losing our son in an accident, it was too much for her." Beatrice held her breath, feeling the weight of David's words like a knife driven into her heart. Each word from him was a confirmation of the devastation she had caused. "That must have been unbearable," she murmured, encouraging him to continue, even though each syllable filled her with deep regret. David nodded slowly, his face reflecting years of accumulated pain. "Amber was pregnant on the day of the accident. She planned to tell me, but after that, everything changed. Even with the birth of our son John, she couldn't get over what happened." Beatrice felt the world collapse around her. She had never known that Amber was pregnant, and the shock left her speechless for a moment. But she forced herself to maintain her composure. "John, was he born healthy?" she asked. David nodded, but his eyes were distant, lost in bitter memories. "Yes, John was born healthy, but Amber, she never recovered. The depression consumed her, and eventually, she asked for a divorce and left, leaving me alone with our son." The pain in David's voice was almost tangible, and Beatrice felt tears beginning to form, but she held firm. "That must have been devastating for you, raising your son alone after everything that happened." David ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "I tried. Mary the First did my best, but the weight of it all was too much. I lost my job, started drinking to try to cope with the pain, and it became a habit I couldn't control. It cost me custody of John. He was sent to a shelter after that. The only place I can find any peace is here, at the bottom of a glass." His words, laden with despair and desolation, pierced Beatrice like a spear. She was hearing firsthand the trail of destruction she had left, and the guilt intensified, almost suffocating her. "But David," she said, "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. No parent should have to face something like that." David let out a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "Apologies don't change anything, Mary. The truth is, I failed at everything that mattered: my family, my life. It all fell apart because of one moment. One damn moment that ruined everything." Beatrice felt the crushing weight of the truth in his words. Knowing that it was her moment, he was referring to the moment when her decision had destroyed an entire life. But disguised as Mary, all she could do was try to comfort him, even though she knew that no comfort would be enough to erase the pain she had caused. David's story pierced Beatrice's heart with a pain she didn't know was possible to feel. Each word from him was like a confession that crushed her under the weight of her own guilt, even hidden under the disguise of Mary. Beatrice felt the urgency to do something, anything to alleviate the pain of that devastated man who unknowingly was sharing his sorrow with the very person who had caused it. "David," she began, her voice soft and full of empathy, "no one should go through all of this alone. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'll be around." David observed her, his gaze tired, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of something that resembled gratitude. "Thank you, Mary. It's not easy to find someone willing to listen without judgment." Beatrice forced a smile, battling the tide of emotions within her. "Sometimes all we need is a friend, someone who can stand by us, even if it's just to listen." They continued talking, and Beatrice realized that despite the suffering they shared, there was comfort in each other's presence. David seemed to open up more with each moment, and Beatrice, under the mask of Mary, absorbed every word, feeling a mix of guilt and relief at being there for him, even if under a false identity. As the hours passed, the conversation deepened. They talked about life, about loss, and about what it meant to try to move on when everything seemed lost. David, who had been so reserved at first, began to feel more at ease, and gradually Beatrice noticed that she was forming a genuine connection with him. "You're easy to talk to," Mary, David admitted at one point in the night, his voice sounding a little lighter, as if the weight on his shoulders had lessened, even if just for a brief moment. "It's only because you finally found someone who understands," Beatrice replied, feeling torn between the joy of helping and the pain of keeping the secret of who she really was. In the days that followed, Beatrice, still as Mary, returned to the bar to meet David. He seemed less somber, less weighed down by sadness. Each time he saw her, her presence became a small point of light in his darkness, and Beatrice couldn't help but notice how he seemed to look forward to seeing her, as if her company brought temporary relief to his wounds. They began meeting more often, not just at the bar but for long walks through the city, where they talked about everything and nothing. Laughter, which had seemed impossible for David, began to emerge in small moments, and Beatrice felt something growing inside her, something she hadn't expected, a fondness that went beyond guilt and the need for redemption. However, each moment of shared happiness with David was tempered by the pain of the disguise Beatrice maintained. She knew that the truth hung over them like a sword, but she couldn't give up the chance to help David find some kind of peace, even if it meant living in the shadow of her own lie. As their friendship grew, Beatrice found herself trapped in a web of conflicting feelings. She loved seeing David smile again, being the reason he seemed to have a little more life in his eyes, but the guilt of living a lie gnawed at her heart, leaving her with an incessant question: how long could she continue without revealing the truth? As time passed, the bond between Beatrice and David strengthened in ways she had never imagined. What began as an effort to alleviate her own guilt and help David find some comfort turned into something deeper. Each meeting, each conversation, each moment of shared laughter and reflection planted the seeds of a feeling that grew in both of them, even if neither had the courage to admit it right away. David, who once hid behind alcohol and bitterness, began to change. The conversations with Mary brought back a part of him that he thought was lost forever. He found himself smiling more, desiring less the company of the bottle and more the presence of her. Gradually, he began to reduce his dependence on alcohol, trading nights of drunkenness for long walks with Beatrice, where the world seemed less dark and life more bearable. For Beatrice, the feeling was a mix of joy and torture. She felt lighter, less suffocated by the weight of the accident. When she was with David, the pain of guilt still existed, but it had been softened by the genuine connection they had developed. Yet this lightness was accompanied by a growing fear, the fear of the day when the truth would finally emerge, shattering what they had built. One day, unable to bear the internal conflict any longer, Beatrice sought out Melanie. They sat in a quiet cafe, the environment contrasting with the storm of emotions Beatrice was about to share. Beatrice began hesitantly, the words struggling to come out. "I think I'm falling in love with David." Melanie looked up from the coffee she was holding, surprised. "Beatrice, are you sure? You know what that means, don't you?" Beatrice nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the reality of what was happening. Yes, I know, but I didn't plan this, it just happened. He's different now, and so am I. He makes me feel alive again. Melanie, always the voice of reason, set her cup aside and looked Beatrice in the eyes. Beatrice, I understand that you want to find some happiness after everything, but you can't keep hiding the truth from him. He deserves to know who you really are. You both deserve a chance to start over, but not with a lie between you.